He's the quickest guy. This is, for me, most talented guy around today. He's easy to handle, in a way, for me at least. Even he's completely different to all the other guys. He enjoys life in a different way than anybody else. He travels around between the races. He tweets from everywhere. He comes back, he's there, he's fit. You need to give him this freedom that makes him strong. Some other guys do it completely different. They train every day, they concentrate. But Lewis is Lewis. I like him, he performs fantastic.
No one in the history of Formula One has taken more wins than you. You're out on your own.
You will never see a more dramatic conclusion to any motor race, let alone a Grand Prix, than that. And the result of it all is that in the most harem-squarum way possible, he doesn't make it easy for himself, does he? Lewis Hamilton is the world champion.
Still we rise, guys. Still we rise.
Lewis Hamilton by every means is the biggest superstar to have risen from the motorsport world. A man with more records than any before him and one with a celebrity status far ahead of his peers. In 2020 he joins the ultimate elite class of drivers. And on this episode we'll be dissecting how Hamilton has reached this larger than life persona and what habits and behaviours make up the 7-time world champion. As with many sporting greats, the foundations of success are laid early. The hours are put in, technical ability sharpened, but most importantly, the mind is geared in a way to hunt victory. Some conditions encourage a more convenient way to the top, but as ever, this is not the case for the young Lewis Hamilton. He was grown into a family with separated parents who ran multiple jobs and had to take extra responsibilities way above his own abilities. Lewis Hamilton was your typical rags to riches story. Now admittedly, the roots of glory were sown by a ruthless father who gambled it all on his kid as an escape from poverty, ensuring the young Brit would practice, develop the cognitive prowess and compete against drivers often twice his age. And in the face of adversity, only Hamilton's name would be ringing in the ears of the motorsport elite. At just 13 years of age, McLaren director Ron Dennis picks up the baton and financially supports Lewis through his rise to an F1 start. And as Hamilton graduated from one single-seater category to the next, it became inherent that the teenage star was destined for the greats. It was on this pre-Formula One journey that Hamilton met future world champion Nico Rosberg, a friendship with the son of the 1982 world champion Keke Rosberg. It was an opportunity to reach deeper into the web of the F1 circus. An opportunity that Anthony Hamilton made full use of. In 2006, Rosberg made the leap into Formula One and impressed on his debut, taking home points on his first stint in Bahrain. Meanwhile, in the junior ranks, Hamilton was blazing the rest of the field all season long. Surely this was going to be the glimpse of what was to come for the future kingpin. Eventually, after just one stint in GP2, Lewis christened the Formula One paddock, landing one of the most sought-after race seats on the market. He would partner none other than reigning double world champion Fernando Alonso, who at the time, and also for much of Hamilton's career, would be the best pound-for-pound pure racer. We're talking about someone who was able to convincingly stop the dynasty of Ferrari's Michael Schumacher, and for any driver to fill the cockpit of that number 2 McLaren and join the garage alongside Alonso would surely have to endure a grueling season playing second fiddle. That wasn't Hamilton, however. He not only outperformed his teammate, but he very nearly won the championship on his first attempt, missing out by only 1 point. These are near unheard of feats in any elite level of sport, let alone the confines of the motorsport's upper echelon. The very next season, Hamilton was able to convert the second place to championship glory, taking the fight right down to the final corners of the final lap and on the final race in 2008. A clutch title performance which cemented the foundation of the rising star's wonder career. From here, much of his time at the Woking team, he continually impressed as a genuine title contender. During the same time, Lewis was showing his face in other outlets, a poster boy, golden child, call it what you will. The Brits management team were having an influx of companies requesting his advertising time. It was also around the same time that Hamilton was seen as a fashion icon, being seen more on red carpets than podiums and candid paparazzi photos with big names across media. But I suppose you all already know this. You know, at least on a surface level, what Lewis Hamilton has been able to achieve, what spheres of influence he draws upon outside of the car. You know the lifestyle, the music, the big brand advertising campaigns and sponsors, all of this is known. But how did he get to this level? Why has Hamilton achieved so much? Now, there's no easy way to answer this, but going through countless hours of old interviews and hearing his closest peers speak about his racecraft, it became increasingly apparent that a lot of his later success with Mercedes was drawn from his own upbringing. He was conditioned and placed into an environment which brought the best out of him. He also endured a challenging upbringing and one with much criticism from his predominantly white competitors, as this was perhaps most evident when Hamilton occupied the top step of the podium. Racially motivated hate was embedded in the lower ranks of motorsport, and to some extent it still is. But here came this father and two sons to the Sunday tracks with the kart only barely legal to compete, and to be honest, the way how it's all been described shares some parallels from the Disney movie Cool Runnings and how a Jamaican bobsleigh team comes to compete at the Winter Olympics. These people were breaking the norms. Hamilton was taught to overcome this kind of adversity. He developed a mental aptitude for any kind of criticism later in life, right at the start of it. His father Anthony considered this a psychological advantage, and as Lewis matured, it was this dynamic relationship the two shared that proved fruitful as time went on. He was very much a get stuck in and get your hands messy kind of driver, and this is something clearly evident from his karting days. Yes, you could argue that all kids are daring in the junior feeder series, but to a degree like this, well, it has a sense of something special written all over it. The support group doesn't just stop there. Have you ever heard of a certain someone called Nicholas Hamilton, that racing driver who battles and overcomes cerebral palsy on a daily basis and still performed at an optimal level? Well, if you haven't, he just so happens to be Lewis's younger brother, and the two both grew up around the track. Lewis saw the constant struggles that his younger brother would go through. There was never a sense of normality or comfort in watching one of his closest relatives endure the fatigue of completing basic activities. But this is where the important lesson of resilience would instill itself into the mind of the future world champion, to visualize and feel the struggle and move on to embrace it, keep moving forward and to not quit when the going gets hard. Lewis would have identified that Nicholas, by his own character, didn't seem to be as mentally affected by the disability as much as Lewis would have perceived it to be. In fact, Lewis had actually spoken about this in interviews in the mid-2010s, that his brother never once complained about the lifestyle that he had, and how seeing this emotionally helped Lewis in his own career. And in the same way, Lewis would see his own father develop a work ethic which was far beyond what some of the other fellow kart racers may have experienced. Yet his father never seemed to show the burden so much. This is something that I will follow up later on in this video, where Hamilton is surrounded by a father who was helping to lift both his sons as high as physically possible. I now want to divert your attention to the man outside of the car. Away from the track, there doesn't seem to be any other former or current driver that has cross-platform influence like Hamilton does. Now you could argue that perhaps Senna moved more people within the nation of Brazil, but if we're talking proper mainstream media impact, it has to be Lewis Hamilton. With multiple fashion lines, with some of the world's most reputable brands, and now more recently being an ambassador for numerous tech firms, there seems to be an ever-growing pool of circles from which Lewis can draw inspiration from. And it's also fair to say that this aspect is often overlooked when comparing his championship status to others before him. It's this lifestyle characteristic which has certainly divided opinions and commonly viewed as a distraction or time wasting among pundits alike. But it would be unfair to dismiss these characteristics about him. If you're like me, who has spent a lot of time this year indoors reading books that would have otherwise been collecting dust on my shelf, you may have come across a book called Rebel Ideas, The Power of Diversified Thinking. It's a book written by the talented Matthew Syed, and in the book Syed references to the key global events that could have benefited from a different way of thinking, or with non-linear protocols. Examples from the summit of Everest, the tragedies of September 11 to the reinvention of nutrition as we know it could have all benefited from a more holistic picture of the world at large. In this case, the world being the Formula One circus, and by diversification I mean Lewis continuing to experience a non-traditional Formula One driver lifestyle. I don't necessarily mean that parties and red carpet experiences, but more of the surreal experiences that he's been fortunate to have, feeling the struggle, being involved, and ultimately coming back to the track with a mindset and belief of success and purpose. At the start of the video, you heard the late great Niki Lauda speak of this very attribute and how most, if not all, drivers have a very different approach to this, and that by virtue of Hamilton taking the road less travelled doesn't always mean more success, but it does give him a more complete arsenal when the challenges do come. For one, he unquestionably brings in new fans from other domains, most of whom develop a taste for motorsport itself. This also helps to shift the sport into a new direction and helps it evolve from a somewhat consistent championship series while Ecclestone was still in the F1's Iron Throne. Secondly, the so-called distractions actually allow Hamilton to focus his attention away from the high-pressure racing. He's openly spoke about how he produces music away from the Grand Prix weekends. This is purely a method of helping him de-stress and ultimately allows him to perform better on race day, which is what as fans we all want. Now this next topic is something which is constantly debated by pundits, ex-drivers and commentators alike, and that's pure talent. More specifically, is Hamilton the most talented driver in the history of the sport? Now this part of the video is either where, depending on if you're a Hamilton fan or not, you will decide to switch off the video. I hope it's the latter of the two, but do follow my line of thought. Hamilton's statistics stand for themselves. Most poles, most race wins, 7 world titles, all mind-boggling statistics considering that most of these figures he's achieved in the past 7 seasons alone. He's had the best car, I hear you say. Take it or leave it, but this argument is simply void because no champion has ever won a world title without having a superior car. This has been the case in the past and will most definitely be the case in the future. And yes, there are more revised measures to reduce the gap between the front runners, the middle order teams and the bottom teams, however there will always be some advantage among teams. But back to Hamilton. There's only ever been a handful of drivers, both past and present, where you can directly make a comparison to him. You have your usual suspects such as the Sennas and the Laudas and the Schumachers, all of whom have won multiple world championships and have a long-lasting careers. But you have to also consider other drivers, even pre-war and pre-championship, who have outstanding records, and I will consider all of these drivers in this instance. Over 1 lap qualifying, there is just nobody else who compares to Hamilton, period. He has a different kind of focus and an innate ability to wrap a car around a circuit in such an unbelievably quick time. He's actually made a routine of how he wants his 1 lap pole to go ahead, and he sets his team up in such a way so that he can do this every single time he gets into Q3. It's very rare to see any mistakes in his qualifying laps, and when he does, he's very calculative in analysing the data on where he can make up ground on the race day. And it's on race day where Lewis truly comes into his own element. Pole or not, Hamilton is in so many ways one of the greatest dogfighting racers ever. Instinctively, he is able to create scenarios which puts an unbelievable amount of pressure on his rivals. His racing IQ alongside his experience provided a challenge that only few others can muster up the courage to rival, and there have been plenty of examples where Hamilton has engaged in wheel-to-wheel racing over the years with multiple world champions alike. Take his first season with 2-time champion Fernando Alonso at McLaren. The young stud goes head-to-head against the only person that had dethroned the great Schumacher the years before. Another of Hamilton's best traits is his fighter pilot ability to navigate his car to a strong finish, even when the odds are stacked against him. This, to be fair, is down to 2 factors: a good team strategy and a consistent racecraft from Hamilton to execute on. Most recently in Mexico 2019, he was able to calmly bring his own worn tyres from a single pit stop more than half the race distance, a feat that 1 in 100 could achieve. This is the type of ability that comes from years of practice and harnessing the ride to feel the absolute limits of the car. It's what separates normal champions from the great champions. But it's not just these talents which has brought Hamilton and Mercedes these victories. Lewis admits himself that without the fierce competition from a select few, he would never have worked as hard or developed his racecraft in such a way. Who better to begin your Formula 1 career than joining reigning double world champion Fernando Alonso, arguably the most fair driver of the post-Schumacher era. From the get-go, Hamilton was forced into a fight-or-flight trance, being put at the top of the team against another top driver. Lewis had to mature quickly in his new environment, and that he did. Not only breaking numerous records on his debut, but also coming within 1 point of the title in his first season as a rookie. This rivalry would manifest itself into a unique relationship in many years that followed, and only got more intense with the arrival of Sebastian Vettel. The trio would be the face of the championship battle, where even Alonso and Hamilton grew to find common ground in light of the Red Bull Racing dominance. It was these hard and intense few seasons which prepared Hamilton for a new kind of challenge for the seasons to come. The 2014 season was staged to bring newer hybrid vehicles and cheaper powertrains, all in line with an ever-diversifying sport and new ownership in place. This was a time which saw the Mercedes driver evolve into a multiple world champion that we see him as today, and with it a rivalry between himself and teammate Nico Rosberg, which was so genuine and at times poisonous that it'll undoubtedly go down as one of the greatest of all time. The past 7 years has just so much to speak about and discuss, and I'm sure in the future I'll have the time to break each season down, but for the purpose of this video I'm only going to speak about one team and one driver. It was the optimistic and now late Niki Lauda whom originally planted the seed into Hamilton's mind to move elsewhere, a potential move from the team that had brought him to Formula 1, and his first world title was unprecedented at the time and sparked a major talking point for the F1 machinists. Why would a champion choose a team with less capability? However, with that being said, a different kind of might was required to overcome the tight grip that RBR had on the sport in the seasons just gone. Ross Brawn, who was a team principal of Mercedes at the time, and Niki were big believers that having the right structure and the correct team environment will bring the best out of a driver. After all, it was Brawn who led Michael Schumacher to multiple title wins. This is all well and good being said, however it is vital to ensure that each member of the team was being worked on and developed throughout their career at Mercedes Motorsport if they were to be considered as a high performance team. Making sure that each facet of the team from R&D to race engineer to chef all carried the same kind of rhythmic zest, which helped to ensure the team would operate like a championship winning constructor. And that they did. Race after race and year after year, the team utilised an experienced and well-polished playbook, which helped win races on paper before the lights even went out. The Mercedes strategists wanted to have as much control of the Grand Prix weekend as possible, and by having a reliably quick driver as Hamilton behind the wheel made winning that much easier. At times the racing was boring, but equally so it was beautifully choreographed, and nobody, not even Hamilton haters, can argue against that. Hamilton was a mere piece of the puzzle for Mercedes. He acted as a spearhead and ultimately ended up being the face of the team and the sport in doing so. So, where does this leave us? We've discussed how his early environment by means of his upbringing made him more resilient to difficult conditions. We discussed how outside of his racing, his persona helps to add balance to a high-pressure sport, and how the rhythm of his off-track lifestyle helps him get better and better on track. And we've just discussed why having the right environment fosters Hamilton's innate racing talent to be exercised more frequently. If you've made it this far, I just want to say thank you, and I just want to end it on one final point. In the beginning of the video, I mentioned how I wanted to explore why Hamilton was such a fascinating person to study. I also wanted to analyse why there's just no other champion like him, and here's why. Firstly, let's deal with Senna and Prost, two of the greatest drivers in Formula 1, but both had their dark sides. Alain Prost deliberately crashed into Ayrton Senna in 1988, and then Senna deliberately crashed into Prost in 1989. Those two were not above breaking the rules of racing in order to win the championship. Understandably, do what you gotta do to win, but by no means would it take away from their talents. But there's a little part of their character that existed. Then we move on to the likes of Michael Schumacher, who near enough like for like matches Lewis in being statistically the greatest F1 driver of them all. But he too had that little edge. Whether it was 1994 ramming into Damon Hill at Adelaide, whether it was 1997 ramming into Jacques Villeneuve in Jerez, or whether it was in 2006 crashing in Monaco to secure pole position, and this was actually a technique later employed by fellow countryman Nico Rosberg just a mere decade later. Nonetheless, all these little things slightly undermine the true championship status of a driver. But Lewis Hamilton pretty much has no incidents of that kind in his history. There was a little bit of drama in 2007 with Alonso where he was supposed to obey team orders and let his teammate pass in qualifying. There was a bit of rough and tumble racing and hairy moment with Vettel in Baku, but in the grand scheme of things, Hamilton is incredibly fair and incredibly clean. Lewis Hamilton really is the complete package. You've got the one-lap qualifying pace, which is absolutely unbelievable. You have the wheel-to-wheel racing where he's very rarely beaten. He pulled off some extraordinary maneuvers in his career. And then you have the pure race pace where he's able to dominate a Grand Prix from the front and take victory, and now has 7 world championships, all within the letter of the law. As a pure racing driver, Lewis Hamilton is undoubtedly up there with the greats of the sport. But for me, it's that unblemished record. It's that lack of controversy, that pure sportsmanship, which in my opinion, just puts him above all the other greats.